بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين ثم أما بعد. Assalamu alaikum everybody, as well as assalamu alaikum to our guest speaker, Brother Danish. Inshallah, before we officially start and I introduce our guest for tonight, I just wanted to let everybody know, inshallah, who's tuning in, that this event is situated within a series of events and programs that Mass Pace is organizing over the course of the next couple of weeks, inshallah. And what we wanted to do was, as we've been observing a lot of the responses to the COVID pandemic by different institutions, different communities across the world, and specifically in the United States, I think we have been really thinking about the way that just people have been responding and some questions that brings forth. And I think part of the Mass Pace sort of, I guess, like thematic framing for the next couple of weeks is to really push people to really think about how do we situate ourselves in relation to what's going on around the world materially in terms of the pandemic, as well as like spiritually, the state of our ummah, the state of our hearts in relation to all of this. And although Mass Pace, the department is more so a political one, right? One that engages in political analysis. We wanted to make sure that we started off by really reflecting on obviously the spiritual, right? And making sure that we all really think about how we are actually thinking about all of this, not just constantly being inundated with motivational talks and so on and so forth. So I wanted to bring on a very dear brother, one who is doing very important work, mashallah, in the community, Brother Danish Qasim, who is here with us. And for folks that don't know of him or know him, Brother Danish actually graduated from UC Berkeley in 2010 with a BA in Religious Studies. He began a formal study of the Islamic sciences in 2006 with local teachers, and then served as an Arabic translator while in college. Upon graduating, he dedicated himself to full-time traditional Islamic studies. And most of his overseas were in Mauritania, in the school of Murabat al-Hajj. He's authorized by his teachers to transmit the Islamic sciences, and has also been working with victims of spiritual abuse for 10 years now. And you can learn more about him, and I encourage you to actually read his blog. It's called In Sheikh's Clothing. You can just, I will link it later, inshallah, on the Facebook page, insheikhsclothing.com. And actually, Brother Danish put forth an article in the past couple of days where he reflects on the pandemic. And I actually want to start off with that. So, Brother Danish, if you can actually tell us, for those of you that have or have not read the article, just let us know a little bit more about the contents of the article on Muslim matters.
Assalamu alaikum. So, the article I wrote was about Muslim reactions to the coronavirus and why I believe it's been difficult for Muslims to understand it religiously. Of course, if people have faced tragedy, that's always going to be hard and difficult to deal with. None of that is a problem. But what I was really trying to look at is, why was it a religious problem? In terms of, why would a tribulation cause religious confusion of how this could happen if we're not doing anything bad? So to say that, is the pandemic or other forms of tribulation, do we view them as a punishment, or do we view them as something that doesn't make sense if we're not doing anything bad? And does being a good Muslim mean a good worldly life? And I think that's really the mistake that a lot of Muslims believe. And it goes back to the type of da'wah that we have in conferences and in programming, where we're just taught really to go do well in school, to get a good job, and that's what it means to be a good Muslim. As if you follow that process, nothing bad will happen. And that's completely antithetical to the message in the Quran, where constantly we hear things like وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, that the end affair is for the believers. And worldly success is not worldly rewards is not something that we get for being good Muslims. So that's what I wanted to really address, and why I think we have to change the way we view religion and learn more so we don't have these sort of issues.
And then I think more of an elaboration on that, you talk about the concept of prosperity Islam. Can you elaborate a little bit more about that?
Right, so there was this evangelical concept of the prosperity gospel. You can look up things like, it's called, I believe, the evangelical, work ethic. And really this idea that God wants us to be wealthy, and even wealth is a sign of divine favor. And if we follow the procedures in the Bible, or prescriptions rather, in the Bible, then it would let Christians be wealthy and have worldly success. And that's where you get a lot of televangelists and their own celebrity cultures with mega churches and mega preachers. And Muslims were following that trend as well, unfortunately.
How do you feel like that has been exacerbated or has been displayed in more acute ways during the pandemic?
So I think one is you'll see programs even of just doing really well in the pandemic. Don't let it hold you back, and it's a very you-centered reaction to the whole pandemic. And I think that one thing we need to really understand is a lot of the talks, the feel-good lectures, that it's time to be a little bit more serious and understand that if we're missing those kind of lectures, it's not time to just put them on a webinar, but it's rather a time to learn formally and to get more serious with the religion. So when you say how does it play out in the pandemic, one is specifically a lot of programs that people are needing in terms of how do we process this as Muslims, or how could this happen? Which again, I mean, it's good if people need that to attend. Definitely, that's I'm not blaming that. However, it's not an issue that should have come up to Muslims who have been practicing, who have been attending religious programming for a number of years. And the fact that this is an issue to some shows that the teachings themselves have failed.
Okay. And so with that, then, what is your advice then to sort of invert or to shift gears from just kind of focusing only on like motivational programming, and also taking into consideration the political ramifications, the political consequences of everything happening with the pandemic, that it's not simply an engagement between you and the pandemic, but is you constituted within a larger ummah, you constituted within a larger reality of that has so many different angles to it. And sometimes that these feel-good motivational speeches or lectures or reminders can sometimes hinder folks from really like critically like thinking about what's happening.
So I mean, to bring it a little full circle, the idea then of when I say studying more and studying proper text, which I mentioned in the article as something Muslims should do, the reason for that is you get a full picture of the religion. When you're just watching like these
snippets,
snippets and bite-sized videos, like people like to call them, you're not really going to get a full picture of the religion. And if that's the only way you engage with learning more about Islam or getting information about Islam, you're going to have a different religion altogether. Because one, not everything about Islam or life can be on the internet, right? So this is something Neil Postman talks about in Amusing Ourselves to Death, Technopoly, both books I highly recommend, that the medium, it shapes the message that we put out. And when you take religion and put it on television, which he primarily wrote about, you get a new religion altogether. It's no longer what your actual scripture would say. So, I mean, I know people who have done marketing on Twitter for religious organizations, and they have to pick and choose which verses they put on Twitter, because not everything is in the Quran is tweetable. Some of it, it's not as, the way people would read it wouldn't be as warm or as inviting. So when you have to like pick and choose which parts of the Quran you could even put out there, or what are topics we could talk about just openly, and there's no greater call to invite people into learning, but it sort of just stays at the place of motivational lectures, which is what the short clips all they could provide, then we're not building upon anything. But what that does is it leaves people unable to deal with the realities of life from a religious perspective. So why I push to learning is, again, instead of just lectures on what the Quran says or why we should study the Quran. It's time to actually get into it, to read the Quran, to reflect upon the Quran, to learn about the lives of the Prophet. Because it's too easy for people to just be dependent on other speakers, sort of just performing anecdotes from the Sirah. That's not what our level should be, because we have years of information on different stories of the Sirah, even like different hadith. But what has that done for people? And this is where we need to ask ourselves, if you've been listening to certain speakers for years and years, what have you really gained? Can you teach a text on Sirah now? Do you even know the different tribes that were in the Arabian Peninsula? How many Sahaba could you name? And people really just become accustomed to the performance of these short clips. So learning, I mean, it's one of the really best things you could do. Allah that Allah elevates the people from you who believe and have been given knowledge by degrees. So this is something we should all be pursuing. And the Prophet ﷺ said, Rabbi zidni ilma, right? He was said to say that. And the ulama mentioned, if there were anything higher, the Prophet would have asked for that. So my point being is that we have to also understand what knowledge is. It's not these feel-good lectures. And I feel like these type of events unveil how ill-prepared or how uneducated we truly are, even if you spend a lot of time following or watching clips. And then what was your second question about the larger?
I think I was going to take it into another direction, but we can revisit that later. But looking at how, like, I mean, it's been almost, like a month since folks have been asked to stay at home. And in terms of just the way that we've seen really just constant just influx of listen to this lecture and listen to that lecture, but how have people seriously engaged their time in a way where there is some development of ilm. Even I remember you mentioned in the article, just reading Quran, praying right together. People would have halaqas where they are studying up on a text. And so this idea that the secondary, and I believe we touched upon this before, but how this sort of secondary focus that used to serve as a vehicle for motivating people to learn more about their deen, to read more Quran, to refine their prayers, to really discipline themselves, and how all of these sort of facets of the secondary have now sort of seeped into and have actually replaced the primary. And so the question becomes, is that enough? And I think that's what you really push us to think about in our article. Yeah.
And I think the problem also becomes that we don't know what to do when the snack-sized Islamic clips aren't available. So we just produce more. Or if the feel-good gatherings aren't welcome anymore, aren't available anymore. So we just bring that into the home. Whereas when it's time to be serious about religion or to worship, people don't know what to do, and that's the problem. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying all time at home should be spent worshiping or doing something serious. I'm not saying that. Go out, exercise, be with your family, do all those things, right? But what is your religious activity? That's the question. And when people are stuck on that, and they've been involved in religious conferences and in programming for so long, you have to wonder what the content of those programs was. Why has it left people so unable to know what to do? Right? So why do people need a YouTube to fill their time, or are looking for webinars on Islamic lectures to fill their time? Now, if somebody's learning, for example, there are good classes, and that's why I recommend Shama'il or Quran classes, learning Arabic. That's all fine. I'm not putting any of that down. However, when people just need to watch clip after clip, or are looking for programming to fill time because they don't know how to be religious outside of this sort of context, that's the problem.
Right. And not to say that some of the programming that is out there is not beneficial or useful, but rather that is not the end goal. I also wanted to add that as well. I wanted to ask you, Brother Danish, in your article you mentioned the following: even with widespread calamity and suffering, many of us still have a very self-centered way of understanding events and do not hasten to good actions. What do you mean by this? I know there's more contextualization before and after the sentence, but I felt like it was a good summary.
Yeah, so I mean, a lot of the spirituality we have now is influenced by New Age thought and New Age spirituality, which is extremely self-centering. So these ideas, for example, of self-improvement, it's even, and then you'll see workshops on like having a productive Ramadan, copying from language of like entrepreneurship, how to be productive, the best you. And that's not, it resembles spiritual development, but it's not, it's still very different. So it's like Islamically, what we do to better ourselves in Suluk, it's not a checklist of just different items to check off. I did this, I did that, right? We're supposed to pay attention to not just the output and production, but the non-quantifiable aspects as well, like our intention, our presence, khushu. And that gets thrown out the window when we just have checklists and are looking for things to do almost robotically to be a better person. So acts of kindness are a good example. Somebody would say on these kind of manuals for self-improvement, like do a random act of kindness today, and you just go do it. And it's not even, you're not able to properly prioritize if you're just looking at different things to do to be a better you. Or for example, apologizing to people. You'll have people who, when you have a very self-centered way of spiritual growth or being a better person, apologizing is not because you feel contrition, you just feel like you have to do it on your path to being a better person. And are you really looking to right those wrongs, or is it just something you need to do, check off your list and then move forward? And they resemble one another, but there's a very serious difference because we pay attention to the quality, not just the quantity of what we're doing. And also the means matter. So for example, we're not just looking for a gratifying state that could be achieved through any means. The means matter. So how we relate to X, Y, and Z and how to get to that gratifying state really matters. So for example, you have now, when you put that to the side, you have meditation went from learning from a master to now you just learn from an app, because the goal is not, we don't pay attention to what gets us there.
Right. And I think that's oftentimes very much shaped by this larger like neoliberal framing of productivity, neoliberal framings of, like you're saying, entrepreneurship, this idea that our worship or our spirituality can sort of be categorized, boxed off through these different like modes of like self-development, self-help style that can actually be, that it's very important to recognize how these framings affect the way Muslims are practicing Islam today, and that conflating, for example, these ideas of like how to be a productive Muslim or how to spend quarantine productively by being able to do like X, Y, and Z. These are irrationalities that are very much shaped by these larger phenomenons and also economic structures that I think is important to recognize.
Right. Yeah, and we see that in how we even value products, Islamic products. So a YouTube clip, if it has more views, that's marketed. It's been viewed this many times, as if that speaks to how good the clip is or how beneficial it is.
Right, we see that too in the Twitter world.
Yeah.
Right.
And then once that becomes a point of a type of validation, then you end up tweeting things that are going to be tweeted more, that it'll get more retweets. You'll say things that are viewed more, and you end up pandering to public opinion. And it's not that somebody who does this is a sellout. It's just a natural conclusion of the means that we're taking.
Right. I wanted to ask you about sort of going off of what you were talking about earlier, but why do you think then it is important to connect, first of all, to challenge some of the way, like the hyper individualization of spirituality and Islam, obviously to challenge that, but to also understand the importance of, us as individuals within a larger communal imperative, within a larger ummah, and just the political consequences of that, the spiritual consequences of that. I wanted to get your thoughts.
Okay, so one, our spiritual progress has to be focused on developing virtue and ridding ourselves of vice. That needs to be the primary focus. So, and then you start in priorities. What's more important? What's less important? And then we have the option. It's not considered selfish because first, the only person you're responsible for, or primarily, is yourself. And if you have family, then family members, that comes into it as well, if you're a parent. But the first person is yourself. So you don't get into other areas if it's going to harm you personally. But that harm, so we have the option to disengage, for example, like the metaphor of living on the mountain. That's allowed if a person chooses to do so. However, it's better to also be engaged civically and to work and to help other people. Like there are hadith that say that the best actions after the obligatory actions are those that are most beneficial to other people. The strong believer is better than the weak believer, but both of them have khair in them. So the weak believer, the strong believer would be someone who's able to mix with others, help them, and continue on their own as well. So a person that option exists. We don't necessarily put that down, but we will have, for example, people who just in their religious bandwidth will only do certain religious programming, which is very self-centered, and then they'll live life and go out, watch movies and hang out with their friends, but not engage in or even put down religious activity like activism or charitable works. So that's not being sincere to the idea of being of not engaging more in society and just working on yourself, because that's not how a person's actually living their life. So it is better, yes, to engage in works like soup kitchens or helping the poor, or other areas as well. The two are not in contradiction, but there are many instances where becoming more religious or taking a spiritual path seriously can make a person selfish. If it's just an initial period where they need to first work on themselves, for example, somebody going to the dojo before and getting strong and fit before they go out into the world, that would be fine. But it's not meant to be like the end of it. And for example, the Prophet, the example people will give is when he went on the Isra wal Mi'raj, he was in the presence of Allah. He thought of his ummah there too, and then he came back. I think one of the lines of poetry is وَصَلَّ إِلَى سِدْرَةِ الْمُنْتَهَى رَجَعَ كَيْ يَأْكُلَ مَعَ الْفُقَرَاءِ, that he went past the Sidratul Muntaha, the low tree, and then came back just to eat with the poor people. So even after being in the presence of Allah, he came back to serve the ummah, to be with the poor people and help them.
Right. And then I just wanted to emphasize that it's, I think the demarcation between like the individual, notions of spirituality and the communal, there is an aspect of that is very secular, as if they can be like displaced from each other. And I think that even just reminding ourselves that, like, as we were talking about earlier, that like, in Arabic, ad-din muamala, that this worldview, this religion is not the right translation, but ad-din is about also just your actions, and to learn more about yourself is not the end goal necessarily, and it's about how you are interacting with the people around you, and there's so much about Islam that is very much shaped by just communal interactions that you just can't get from sitting in your room just reading about something or listening to something.
No, and my point was that, like, if somebody's sincerely disengaging, that's a praiseworthy thing. But we have a lot of fake claims of even disengaging and working on yourself, because people compartmentalize their religious life. For my religious activity, I'm just going to do private things. And then publicly, like I said, they'll still go hang out and do all kinds of frivolous activity. But they just will compartmentalize their lives in that way and still think they're like being zuhad and things like that. So if somebody, for example, just goes and lives in the desert and worships Allah truly, that is a praiseworthy thing. You're very unlikely to find it, but it's a praiseworthy quality. However, and also I think we have to also be balanced, and because some people will put down things like prayer, whereas we know the Prophet ﷺ, when he was afflicted with something or something weighed heavily on him, he would go pray. So even before the Battle of Badr, he's about to go into battle, but he was making dua to the point where the shawl on his shoulders was coming off and shaking, and he was guaranteed a victory, yet he was still making dua to that point. So, and I'm only saying that because you do have people who put down this idea of just praying or just making dua, whereas we're meant to be holistic people who do everything. Now, we can make dua and take the means and pray and help people. We can do all of that. And if somebody truly, sincerely disengages and just wants to learn worship, that's not a bad thing. However, most of those claims are very fake because it's not how they actually live life.
Right. Right. And then another point in the article that you mentioned is the importance of recognizing the COVID pandemic as a tribulation. And I don't know if you've been following, although I'm sure you have been, other scholars that have presented it as a punishment, sort of purporting tropes around, again, like you sort of deserve this. So do you agree or disagree with that?
So I use the word tribulation because it's general. There's no interpretation on what it is in terms of ilm al-ghayb and why, from a spiritual perspective, we got it. Tribulation is general. So bad things, when they happen, it can be rafa darajat, like a means of like elevating our rank or purifying us in ways we would not have attained otherwise. It can also be intiqam, like a type of punishment. And that's all in the knowledge of Allah, and nobody really knows. So we know, for example, when bad things happen to Muslims, they get a reward for it as well. Sins are forgiven. It can also be a punishment. And this again is all in the knowledge of Allah. Nobody really knows. So I just use tribulation because it could be no matter what it is, and only Allah knows what it is. We don't have a prophet to tell us. Tribulation still fits. It's an outward judgment. It's not getting into intention or why it happened spiritually. And no one can really say as a fact why it happened.
Right. And I guess I wanted to ask just then more generally if you have sort of like a final spiel about your reflections about the pandemic, and then just sort of reorienting everything that you were talking about in terms of sort of the neoliberalization as well as like the quantification of like, public Islam or Islam in the public sphere, in relation to the pandemic, before we open it up to folks to ask questions.
Let me know if this answers. I mean, one of the issues I saw really is that we don't know how to be serious. So when people are trying more to be serious and what do? I have more time. They don't know where to go. And again, if somebody's a new Muslim or making tawbah and coming in, that's all fine. Everybody like has a different level of how long they've been practicing or learning. But really my focus on the issue was with people who have been involved for so long and still don't know what to do and are now just looking for which YouTube clips to watch, or can we do webinars of this? So for example, when you have gatherings of nasheed and just a little bit of words, that's fine, right? If it's going on in person, great. But does it really need to be a webinar now? I mean, if we're guiding people to Allah, can we just tell people to read or study or just go out with their families or go exercise instead of coming on Zoom to watch it live? And what's the difference really between a nasheed performed live or just a YouTube clip of it? And one of the problems, and you have to understand these things like these 30-day Ramadan reminders, a lot of this is from the marketing perspective of organizations. So for your own Ramadan, don't be on the computer just watching these short clips where you see stories really performed. They're not meant to uplift you or educate you. They're performances. You have the nasheed intros, very emotional. You can watch the facial expressions of how they're conveyed, the quick switching of the camera. The center is the speaker, and it's promotion for the organization first and foremost. They understand that in Ramadan, people have more religious energy. They're looking for good works, and they're going to think this is what you're supposed to do when you have that religious energy. And they're going to use that for their benefit to get more money. People are in a more charitable mood in Ramadan. That's why these things exist. So we should be a little smarter and just plan out ahead of time. How do we plan on spending Ramadan? And don't waste your time with these things. And that's not how you get Islamic knowledge. We become consumers of Islamic knowledge. And if you have the mentality of a consumer, you're going to find a producer. So we're not that innocent either. I'm not at all saying it's their fault for doing it. These are norms that we follow. And if we are consumers, we're going to have people coming and they're going to have something to sell us. So to the other work I do in spiritual abuse, I mean, I tell people, don't be surprised once you find out some preacher was in it for the money. It's big business. don't have a consumer mentality. That's what we can do. We should be serious about our religion. And again, it's not just, also like people who, when they get older, you'll see they don't know what to do with their time. And this is tragic. If there was a life of tarbiyah and learning, people would know how to get older, how to prepare for their transition to the barzakh. They would know what to do. And this is something we really lack. Television, phones, this is something we're very glued to nowadays. And that's a big problem, to the point where, and I hope this doesn't happen, like Zoom iftars, when people miss the community atmosphere, they're just going to eat next to one another. So when you learn and go through, kind of educate yourself on how to spend your time, it's one of the best things you can do. And ultimately, it's a preparation for death.
Right. And before I transition into the questions, because you have a couple, I think for those that hopped on a little bit later, I think sort of a concise summary of a lot of the points that you brought up today is in the following 2 sentences that you write about. We should really ask if we just lack the capacity. Actually, let me go up a second. The pandemic should serve as a sufficient inspiration, and we need to learn how to be serious. I urge Muslims to ignore motivational and feel-good lectures that are now feel-good webinars and focus on studying and worshiping. We should really ask if we just lack the capacity to move beyond motivational lectures, if we still need motivation in the midst of a global pandemic. The fact that after years of programming, the destination is not the Quran for processing events or studying texts for learning is symptomatic of a consciously personality-oriented structure. And so there's a lot of themes, again, that we can always delve into more if people are interested offline about the way that this has developed over the past several years. You have some questions, Brother Danish. The first one.
Is it okay if I just say something else?
Yeah, please, by all means.
So yeah, that really is another part of it, is when we're so stuck on the level of motivation and it becomes normalized in our culture, we see that even when it's a time where do we know how to direct people towards action? And that's, again, speaks to us, not to speak us. Like, why do we still need a motivation, and what are we looking to be motivated by if it's not the happenings around us? And that's why the hadith that I started with on the fitna of Dajjal and illness, that's really why, because why do we need tribulation? And again, if not motivated now, then where's the bet that in old age will be motivated, if you, even on the brink of death? Because again, you have people die. It's not without asking Allah for forgiveness, without working towards a nice transition to the next world. And that's the story of humanity. A lot of people go out that way, unfortunately. So we have to prepare now for the other stages in life.
Right. So your first question that you got is dawah something we should be trying to do in these times?
Yeah, I mean, that's of course, that was a very good thing to do, calling people to Islam. If Allah guides somebody on your hands, when the hadith mentions that it's better than the world and everything in it. Yes, it is. And nothing I said about, or the ideas of working on yourself negate doing dawah and or any type of social engagement. But the only conditions for these things are you first have a solid basis of knowledge in terms of on what you speak about. You don't need knowledge to do dawah for like your friends who just, you tell them you're Muslim oftentimes, especially people in high school or college, they sort of just hang out with you and get interested. So there's levels of dawah, and that's something we should always be engaged in. Okay.
And then somebody's asking, what about webinars that are helping with mental health and family dynamics?
Yeah, even if it's just on biology and someone wants to learn more about biology, these are good things to do. I'm not putting down webinars. The point only was, we're doing one right now, The point only is it should be something of substance, and we should move beyond just inspirational and motivational lectures, because we don't need any more motivation, and move towards something more serious.
Right, and substantial. And the last question is, where can we go to learn the way you are encouraging?
So that, I mean, it depends really what you want to learn. There are program. So for example, if you like Aqidah, Kalam, there's classes by someone in Turkey named Sheikh Hamza Bakri. Those classes are in Arabic. I'm not, and then you have different people teaching Maliki fiqh, Hanafi fiqh. Those classes are available as well. Shemail, you can find something. Sira, there are like a lot of sets on Sira, and those would be good places to or good things to learn, because you're going to build a knowledge base when you do that. It's not just anecdotes and stories. So take notes. And again, if you know somebody personally that you can like pay and learn, that would be good. There's a lot of Egyptian teachers available in the Muslim world. Sorry, Arabic teachers like in Egypt and other places at very affordable rates that you can learn Arabic and spend this time next few months learning Arabic, practice your tajweed. Those would be very good things to do as well.
Right. And before I close it off, Brother Danish, if you have any sort of final remarks, or again, if anyone from the attendees has anything that they would like to ask before we close off, inshallah, please let us know. But Brother Danish, if you have any closing remarks.
No, I think I've talked a lot, but yeah.
Okay, so inshallah, I just wanted to say that before we formally wrap this all up, that the point again of this session was to make sure that people are thinking about the way responses are being characterized, especially during this pandemic, because I think it's very revealing of really where the state of like American Islam is, by looking at the way that all these different webinars, reminders have been cranked out daily by various organizations. Classes have been proposed for folks to join. And again, those classes are very much structured as like how to stay motivated. And I think this kind of begs the question that what does this, and I, there is a value there, but again, when the secondary begins to replace the primary, the question becomes like, why? And we have to be critical about that. And I think that also it can make people get this sort of perhaps artificial, but, or maybe not artificial, but kind of like a temporary feeling of satisfaction or accomplishment. And, the work is still, to be done. And I think that that's super important to think about before we delve into all of all the different events that I think that Mass Pace is going to be focusing on in the coming weeks, where we try to look at the sort of political aspects of the pandemic, but to make sure that like base one is just to remind ourselves that ultimately this is a test for the believer, and this is something that we as Muslims collectively should be really using as an opportunity to be reflecting and to really sharpen our ibadah and to be learning, and not to just stop at, let me tune into like one lecture, and again, this isn't to undermine the importance of like having a webinar. Ironically, we're having one right now, but the content and the substance. And it's very easy as an audience member to sort of be in a displaced, sort of distant role in relation to what you're learning about. And sometimes I think that can pacify people in ways that are sort of dangerous. And so before we delve into, and I will be sharing some more information on our Facebook page, as well as I recognize a lot of the attendees here, so also share with you all, just thinking through these different political aspects, but to remind ourselves first and foremost our responsibility as servants of Allah Azza wa Jal, and to make sure that we hold ourselves accountable. And I'm really, really grateful for Brother Danish coming on to speak with us. We have one more question before we do actually log off. And the question is, do you recommend a person to learn on a deep level of Islam before engaging the youth of the community? So, for example, youth group leaders.
Yeah, the most important thing, one, a person has to learn what's called Fard Ain, individual obligations. So learning how to pray, how to fast, and whatever applies to a person. And then when you do any type of work, the main thing after that is to just know to say, I don't know the answer to that. Let me ask somebody if you don't know the answer. Don't wing it. Don't make up an answer. And that's really how you'll stay safe. So just don't overstep boundaries. That's all.
Okay. Jazakallah khairan. With that, we will close. Barakallahu feek. May Allah reward you for your time and bless your family. We will close with Surah Al-Asr. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالْحَقِّ وَتَوَاصَوْا بِالصَّبْرِ. Ameen. Jazakumullahu khairan. Thank you so much, Brother Danish.
Thank you.
And for those of you here, I will post his article, inshallah, for your benefit. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.